sorry, I keep turning it on. Can we go to Community Board Funding Allocation, item 27?
Thank you. So I'm reporting back after the paper that was presented to the last council meeting lay on the table, so the community board chairs could have further and full discussions about what was proposed. As a consequence of that discussion process, which has involved all community boards and all members of community boards in at least one, if not more, meetings, we have a revised recommendation. The revised recommendation is included in a supplementary paper. We apologise for the lateness of that paper. The lateness is due to the fact that the last community board met and discussed it just 36 hours ago, because we were using that to using the opportunity of community board meetings to discuss this rather than call special meetings. The revised recommendation is as a result of those conversations, and staff feel that it provides a more equitable distribution of funding of community boards than the initial proposal. It is in essence saying, first of all, and this based on support, that a mixed model of allocation or a formula based on a mixed model is the one that has unanimous support from community boards. That model takes into account the population of each community board and equity, the position, if you will, of citizens in that community board. The weighting given to the two elements, the first of population is 60%, the second of equity is 40%. That's a shift from the previous recommendation of 50-50. In order to determine equity, it's probably more of an art than a science, but the recognised method throughout New Zealand at the moment, and people do understand its limitations, is the Social Deprivation Index, and that information is gathered in census along with population data. It looks at 9 elements, and they're set out in the previous paper, and the background to the Social Deprivation Index is included in the supplementary paper. And you can use, the index has 10 indices. We've recommended that indices 6 to 10, 10 being the areas with the highest score, if you will, on the deprivation index, and 1 being the lowest. The index, the way it's used, captures all mesh block areas that are included in that range of indices. We feel that the way it's been applied here is probably better understood now than what it was 2 weeks ago when we presented the paper, the use of it, and we feel it does result in a more equitable distribution, as I said, to community boards. The key question, obviously, is then how do community boards use the money? And the criteria for the use of the money is set out in the Strengthening Communities funding outcomes, and they're drawn from the Strengthening Communities strategy, which has been with Council and applied over years for some time now. So should community boards choose to give emphasis in one area more than another, that is their decision, and that's what we're trying to do, is to increase the opportunity for community boards to prioritise and respond to needs. So both prioritise proactively and respond to demands that are coming through. It is not a deprivation fund. I don't think it was ever intended to be, but it is about strengthening communities to be and enabling people to be live healthy and enjoyable lives in their communities. The equity component, therefore, recognises that some communities have more resources than others in order to support citizens to do that. So that's why we're putting an equity rating, or weighting I should say, along with population. Those, the data that we draw on will be updated in the next census, and it will reflect obviously population shifts and relative equity. So the recommendation is that first of all a model for distributing the money to community boards so that community boards can make their call on what's appropriate in their communities is based on a formula, that the formula gives a 60% weighting to population, of 40% weighting to equity. that information is drawn from the census, that recognising the position of the Banks Peninsula, if you just use the formula, they get very little money. However, we understand that, first of all, a critical mass of money is required in order to support any community, and that area of our city has got some particular challenge in terms of population distribution, isolation, distance of travel, etc. So we're proposing that a subsidy of $140,000 is allocated to the Banks Peninsula Board, as well as the formula-based allocation funding. So that's where we've got to. I really appreciate the conversations that all boards have engaged with, and I reiterate that there is 100% support from boards for the model and the subsidy going to Banks Peninsula. There was some variation of views in terms of what the ratio would be, what index in terms of 6 to 10, and the amount of subsidy for Banks Peninsula.
One quick question.
Yes.
When you said that you referred to the boards having some agreement, are you really meaning that the majority of boards had agreement around this proposal?
Yes. It's fair to...
No?
Oh, sorry.
No, the
idea that we split, you know, that we
Yep.
have a formula
The ratio.
or a framework.
100% agreement on the formula or
Yep.
framework.
On the formula framework.
That's right.
But there is disagreement as to whether it should be 5 to 10 or 6 to 10, and whether it should be
50-50,
50-50,
60-40.
60-40. Was there any support for 70-30?
There was there was support for 80-20 from one board, but that was then, but not majority support. That question was raised at a board conversation, but not majority support.
So my question is, was the majority support for the 60-40?
Yeah. Okay. I have to answer this in two ways.
Depends on whether it's 5 to 10 or 6 to 10.
It depends on whether it's 5 to 10 or 6 to 10. It also depends on the nature of the board. Some communities are pretty evenly split in terms of population and equity, so it made little difference, to be fair, how you distribute it. Other communities have got a different distribution between population and equity, and so it makes a bigger difference. So if we were to say majority, councillor, I would say yes. If we were to say take the whole city into account, we'd say no. So that, I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I think it's important to point out the differences.
That's very clear.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's good.
All right, so, question, yeah.
No, it's okay. I just wanted to
Thank you. Just a very quick question on the Banks Peninsula subsidy.
Yes.
With the 140,000 subsidy proposed in the model that we've got in front of us,
Yes.
how does that see the Banks Peninsula funding compare with the 2015-16 year, noting that that's the best comparison because, of course, 16-17 was a little bit anomalous?
Thank you. In 2015-16, Banks Peninsula, we're talking about a total, councillor?
Please.
Yes, 193,000. So it's very, very close. And in fact, the model that's proposed equates very closely for most boards, based on population, to the funding received in the 15-16, 14-15 years.
Jimmy and then Jamie.
One question, you particularly mentioned regarding to the ratio, you know, from your original recommendation, 50-50.
Yes.
You have amendments at 60 and 40.
Yes.
All right. But regarding to this change, some community board, their funding has been a little bit dropped. Whether they still agree? You mean?
Yes.
They still agree.
Well, I think there are two. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think there are two issues that community boards got to discuss. One was what was in their best interest for their board.
Yes.
And two is what's in the best interest of the city. There were marginal changes for 5 of the boards. There were more significant changes for 2 of the boards. I think I know that the process and model has always enabled boards to jointly fund projects, and this continues, both formally and informally. So one board could act as a good neighbour and say, look, we'd like to help you out with that because we think it's a good thing to do. So all boards understood in quite a lot of detail, which I think has led to perhaps the longer discussion than we would otherwise have, what the implications of each of the models is. And we presented 4 different scenarios.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Lester, 2 things. I guess one, is this essentially a placeholder until we have a wider conversation around this come LTP? And 2, if so, is there going to be an opportunity when we have that wider conversation around what those measures are, something a little bit more in-depth than just what those splits look like, but perhaps a wider conversation with the community about whether the deprivation / I know we say equity, but that's, I suppose, interchangeable with the word deprivation, but an opportunity to have a wider conversation around if there might be more appropriate measures and all of that until then.
Yeah, so what we're proposing this, thank you, is that this formula is used for the current funding year, and before the next funding year its efficacy is reviewed. It may well be something the council wants to do is to review the criteria for the Strengthening Communities Fund and have a look at what its explicit position is on issues of equity, and that could be included in a review of the Strengthening Communities strategy, which could be a part of the long-term plan proposals.
Right, any other questions? Right, would someone like to move the motion? Phil and Pauline, now you want to move an amendment?
Yeah, I did want to move an amendment that 5 is amended to 55% population and 45% equity, which is a compromise position, but I think is fairer, and particularly just noting that I think there are some boards particularly that have incurred a huge increase in some of the KLPs and some of the local needs, and I just want to make sure that that can be addressed.
All right, so that's an amendment that's been moved. Is there a seconder for the amendment? There isn't a seconder for the amendment, so thank you. All right, so I'll open the matter up to debate. Aaron?
Yeah, I'll vote against this, even though in the last 48 hours I will thank Lester and the staff for making some compromises based around the concerns from our board, because we come out the worst off, obviously, when you look at the numbers. This is based on a deprivation index, which I think is an incredibly flawed model. In fact, it's one of the main reasons why the CDHB is underfunded is because Treasury are using this model to apply funding to our city with out-of-date stats numbers, census numbers, and a whole lot of people that moved west, and of course that changed their deprivation rating, but also changed their funding, but didn't change their circumstances. So it is flawed, and the great example of how flawed using that model is that the least deprived, or the least amount of deprivation in the entire country, is Banks Peninsula, who we're about to give the most money, because it comes in at 1%, which makes it a better place to live than Zurich or even Singapore. And I do support, I'm not going to remotely suggest we cut any funding from Banks Peninsula, because that reason was explained to us, but it does show us the flaws around the deprivation because it doesn't truly measure it. And as Andrew pointed out to me earlier, there's spots he could take us to visit on Banks Peninsula, I won't name them, where he can show clear examples of deprivation. But it does not come up on the mesh box, it doesn't work like that, and it's a flawed model. I look forward to the way forward, and I'm just saddened because I can't look my ratepayers in the eye in the ward, in the area that I represent, and say this is equity across the city when other people have got twice as much money to build their communities, because it's a Strengthening Communities Fund is what we have.
Phil, Pauline, Dion.
Well, look, I want to support the proposals that are in front of us. As Aaron indicated, the staff have done a huge amount of work on this, and so have the community boards. And in effect, they've arrived at a compromise which actually will work across the city. And Jamie Goff indicated before, yep, as he asked, this is an interim decision till we do our long-term plan. Achieving equity is never easy. And I think that the proposal, though, to have joint funding where community boards be good neighbours with each other, that will help iron out some of the differences, which in fact my own ward, I guess, somewhat shortchanged on. But there's strong agreement from among the boards about the 60-40, the 60-40 split, say. So I'm strongly supporting the recommendations that are there, and I would expect that they'll work.
Pauline.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with Phil there, and this has been incredibly challenging amount of work, I know that, and it gives me comfort that these figures, as Lester has told us, are quite clearly aligned with the 15-16 year, quite closely aligned. So I think that's a really good start for this. Bearing in mind we'll review it in 1 year, and we'll probably have updated data by then. But the other thing that we haven't actually brought into this mix, well, I don't think we have, is that some wards have a higher number of community organisations that are active and performing very well than others, and therefore they may have more call on that funds. It's not necessarily linked with equity either, because you can have proactive organisations that do, so it's not always linked. So that's another, perhaps, a lever that we haven't really, I don't know, done a lot of work on. So you can see how complex it is, but I think this is a very good start, and I particularly like the way that the boards are talking about, you know, cooperating together and jointly funding certain organisations or projects that may actually be sharing the population across the borders there. So I'll be supporting this for today, and I really do hope that we get this through, because we've got community organisations waiting for an answer for their funding now, and you know, the amount of work they do not need to be stressed, wondering and waiting when and if they're going to get their funding for this year. So thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, Dion, Jamie, and then Andrew.
Yep, cool. My button doesn't work very well. I just wanted to voice my support for this as well, purely for the opportunity that this creates to the deprived, or those communities in our suburbs that have got the deprivation within them. And the ward that I represent, the Linwood Central Heathcote, especially in the Linwood area, there isn't a lot of opportunity for people to get on and try and help themselves. And so I think this is a good way for them to try and, I've lost what I was going to say. This is a really good, look, I'm just fully supportive.
Thank you. Take note, everyone, that was a very good contribution. Jamie?
Thank you. We done, guys? Look, I empathise particularly with what Aaron said, because as you all know, we represent the same community board ward area, and to look at it really simplistically and quite correctly, there's an argument to be made, which is factually correct, that we could be perceived as the losers of this, given that we receive the lowest amount per person. So essentially, is this perfect? No, it's not. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. I've said this once. I'll say it again. I haven't changed my opinion on it. If you strive to perfection, you're going to be waiting a blimmin' long time, because perfect doesn't exist. So you need to try and reach consensus. You need to try and reach something good, and you need to make a decision. Deprivation, is that a good measure for doing this? Look, it would be a great measure if this was for the deprivation fund. It's not. It's the Strengthening Communities Fund. And I think the issue about deprivation is that, you know, some of its drawbacks. This is 2013 data, so anyone that is remotely familiar with Christchurch will know that a heck of a lot changes in Christchurch, and has changed at a rate of knots post-earthquake. It's changed significantly since 2013. So we're balancing population data, which is here and now, deprivation data from a census 3 years ago. Isn't ideal. It's averages again, and we're all acutely aware that playing the game of trying to solve problems by averages often can result in perverse outcomes, particularly when I look at the Fendalton area. When you look at the higher end of the Clyde Road area, where the deprivation scores from that would be high, 100 metres down the road, there are probably areas there which I would suggest would have deprivation metrics at the low end, and to call that a 5 probably isn't a fair reflection of what that community actually looks like. So I'm flagging that there are real drawbacks from trying to make policy or decision making based on averages, because average doesn't exist just as perfect doesn't exist. Deprivation also isn't a great measure for need, and strengthening communities is often about what's fundamentally needed, and tinkering with deprivation or using the deprivation metric doesn't actually provide any benefit for older people that might be asset rich but are cash poor and incredibly lonely and need a lot of attention. They're not represented in that. So we've got to a point where we're talking about a 60-40 split, and what I love about governance is the fact that we've got a great diverse group of people that have got a mandate to be here, and I like to think that I get up and go to work because I want to work together with all of you in the best interests of Christchurch to add some value. And making a decision is going to be part of that, and I'm comforted by the fact that at the end of the financial year we're going to have a wider conversation. We're going to say, is deprivation the best indicator to be weighting a significant portion of this fund on? And I will be arguing no, it's not. I think there are other considerations, but I was elected by the Fendalton ward, and I'll be going into bat to give them every cent at community board level. But you've heard me say this so many times ad nauseum, and I'm sorry, but we're here as a city councillor, and we've got to look at Christchurch Inc., what is best for Christchurch, and I'm quite happy for my rates to be a little bit higher to go to someone that needs a little bit more, because that's why we're a city councillor, and I think that that's one of the most fundamentally important aspects about sitting around this table, is that I'd really urge you as a city councillor to ditch the ward just in this forum. You can put that hat back on at community board. I wouldn't argue for 100% deprivation. I'd be vehemently opposing it, because I think that would be completely broken. But on the flip side, I'll also be the first person to argue against a fund being apportioned by rate take, even though that would favour my ward and Aaron's ward very well. But that's just not fair, and I don't think a good city councillor will do that. So this is a compromise position. No, it's not perfect, but I am confident in the fact that we'll have a wider conversation with our community and have an opportunity to correct that. But I think that we've got to a point that actually is quite fair, and I think is going to be best for Christchurch. And I think that I can hold my head high that I've done my job as a Christchurch city councillor by supporting this. So I'd urge you to appreciate the bigger picture with it.
Andrew, Mike, Jimmy.
Thank you. Banks Peninsula obviously has got particular issues around distance and isolation. It's a large ward made up of a number of discrete and different communities, and those isolation and distance issues mean that the strengthening of those communities is particularly important, because they can be cut off from weather events, or maybe aren't able to travel from one of those communities to another regularly or readily. So I'm pleased that that's been taken into account in the recommendation that we've got in front of us. I'd certainly like to acknowledge clearly what has been collaborative discussion at the community board level that recognised that in the discussion between the community board chairs, and recognising, I guess, picking up on the comments that Jamie has just made, and picking up on Aaron's comments earlier as well. Banks Peninsula would be another example of a community where, when you look at it from a deprivation index viewpoint, on the face of it, it would appear that the peninsula is reasonably affluent, but there are pockets, and often quite small pockets, of quite deep deprivation on the peninsula, as there are in other parts of the city, and I think it's important that that also is recognised and has been. So I certainly appreciate the support for the subsidy for Banks Peninsula that allows for a fair and equitable outcome for the peninsula as well as the rest of the city.
Thank you. Mike, Jimmy, Glenn.
Thank you. I'm going to be supporting this resolution, and actually Jamie said a lot of what I was going to say. As a community board member, I could have twisted the figures and splits and then got a really good outcome for the Papanui. And as community board, there was a scenario in there I think gave us an extra 17,000. But as a city councillor, we need to look across all the wards and all the community boards and actually deliver what's probably best for the city as a whole. And obviously the wards areas and community board areas have changed, and I think we need to work together as community boards to deliver some of these outcomes. I know that Belfast now splits across 2 different community boards, so there's things we have to do together. But one of the things, and Pauline touched on it, is community groups are actually really frustrated with this process. They're struggling out there, they're stressed because of the timeframes and being pushed out, and they just want some certainty of what's happening. And if we're going to be looking at this again, we need to make sure that we're doing it early enough to actually set some proper timeframes so they can make proper decisions. Thanks.
Jimmy, then Glenn.
I support this one. The reason is very simple. Because first, staff would like to, take their routine job, try to continue regarding to funding allocation of improvement. That's kind of bigger, very, very good, Otherwise, just doing the routine job. Second is we look at the fairness. But where is the fairness? Some of the probably consider is equity. The other may be the equality. But equity, equality, the bigger difference, one is same head. The other one is from bottom is equal. So probably equality is considered individual situation. But before we probably only consider each board is only in population, a unique factor. But right now it's multi-factor, the prevention. That's pretty good. The more kind of multi-factor, try to achieve this base, the fairest result. And also this amendment is fully supported by the community board, so I support this one.
Thank you. Glenn.
Thank you. Well, I do support Jamie's approach. It's just time to think of city councillors rather than ward councillors. I've got some sympathy for Aaron's, or your situation as 3 councillors actually, having lived nearby Jelly Park. There are some churches there doing some really good, effective community development work, and I just wonder whether we could find another funding stream as and where may be needed, perhaps the community partnership fund once that's up and running, because unfortunately that ward is distorted within itself by the, Clyde Road is a classic. I've door knocked down there. It's so different. You cross over, is it Island Road, and just changes completely. So it's a bit unusual. So I just wonder whether there are some funding options for that, for different parts of the ward at some point.
Thank you. So it's been moved and seconded. There isn't an amendment. So I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. No. Yep. Can you pretend you're out of the room when I put it? Yeah, it hasn't quite rejoined the table, right? So so you'll record Aaron's opposition. So that's carried. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to